Let's start with this. For those of you who know me well, you know I love Coke Zero. Okay? This is one that was purchased for Pastor Appreciation Month. So, appreciate you guys. Listen, it's no secret. Like if you ask Ella, what's Daddy's favorite drink? Coke Zero. Zoe doesn't quite have that many words, but she will see a can and point to it and say, Dada. Okay? So, maybe I have a problem, or maybe you have a problem, okay? But here's the deal. I love Coke Zero, which means that a few years back, things got really tense for me when they changed everything about it. So if you haven't been in the zero sugar game for a while, let me tell you, there was a dark day a few years ago. Because this is now Coke Zero Sugar. It didn't used to be Coke Zero Sugar. It used to just be Coke Zero. The cans were black, and it tasted different. And I remember one day I walked into Walmart, and things looked different. And I was nervous. And I was scared. And here's the deal, y'all. Nobody consulted me. Like, I am an avid lover of Coke Zero. There was no survey. There was no email. Nobody cared to solicit my input. Somebody at Coke Corporate made a call, and we just had a choice. Are we going to keep drinking it, or are we going to reject it? I will tell you, the new flavor actually tastes better. So we are all welcome, okay? But I'll be honest with you, like, I was scared. I wasn't scared. I was nervous. I was unsettled. I was uncomfortable. And some of you are sitting there and you're like, Zach, this is not that big of a deal. You're probably right. But here's the thing. It was something that mattered to me, and somebody had made a decision that made my life more uncomfortable, and I didn't like it. Here's the reality. If we weren't talking about the taste of my favorite soda, and we weren't talking about, like, say, the CEO of Coca-Cola, if we made it more personal, you know it would bring you a little bit more anxiety if this was like your boss making a decision about your job and your future and your family, right? Right? All of a sudden, the stakes get ratcheted up a lot higher. There's a lot more tension. There's a lot more on the line, and that is exactly where we're going to find ourselves in Nehemiah 2. Nehemiah finds himself in a situation where the burden that God has put on his heart collides directly with something that the king has said. And it's going to be a moment where we get to see him courageously display trust in the Lord. Let me show it to you. It says this. We're going to be in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 8. It says, early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Then I was terrified. But I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. The king asked, well, how can I help you? With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, how long will you be gone? When will you return? After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. I also said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. And the king granted me these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. Now, it's some of these types of stories that I think makes this book so compelling, right? There's tension, there's drama, there's risk and reward. And as I have been studying this part of this story, there's two words that come to my mind: trust and courage. And I think that what we're going to see from this story, I think what it's in there to instruct us in is that when we trust God fully, we are free to obey him courageously. When we trust God fully, when we trust God with our whole heart, that is what actually frees us up to obey him courageously. And so what I want to do in our time this morning is I want to show you what his trust looked like and what that trust produced in terms of courage. And so let's start with his trust, because it actually shows up before he says anything to the king. The first thing we see, and we see it in verse 1, is that he trusts God enough to wait on God's timing. He waits on God's timing. And here's why that's true. It tells us in verse 1, it says, early the following spring, in the month of Nisan. That's a timestamp. Now, to be clear, this is not like the time of Nisan, like when there's 0% down and 0% financing. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. That's a good, really hardcore dad joke right there. It was like, I'm going to go full send on it, see what happens, right? Yes, thank you. What this tells us is that it has been about 4 months since he's gotten word that things are not good in Jerusalem. 4 months have passed. That means there's been 4 months of his waiting, his weeping, his fasting, and praying. And I just imagine for 4 months he's been waking up with this burden that God gave him, praying something along the lines of, God, if today is the day, open the door, I'm ready. He trusted God enough to wait on his timing. Do we trust God that much? Because if you notice, what God had already given him was a burden. God had already given him a position with access to the king, but what God had not yet given him was an opportunity. And I think this matters for us because I think so many times what happens is that we sense a burden from God and we automatically assume that right now is the time to act. I have a burden, and that means I have an assignment. Or to use really spiritual churchy language, a calling. And one of the things that I have learned is that a burden plus an opportunity is what leads to the calling or assignment. And a burden without an opportunity is not yet your assignment. And this is why this is so important for us, guys, is that what will happen is that God will put a desire, he'll put a burden, he'll put a dream in our heart. And what we do is we use really spiritual language like God gave me a calling, God gave me a purpose, God gave me this assignment as a trump card that means I'm doing it right now whether anybody wants me to or not. See, what happens as you look throughout the Bible is God often plants a dream in somebody's heart long before he opens the door. Right? Think about David. David gets anointed king when he's a teenager, and he's going to spend years on the run before he ever gets appointed king and sits on a throne. Maybe he's done something similar in your life. Maybe God has given you a burden or a desire or a dream for something that is not in the season that you're currently in. Like maybe right now, what your dream is the ability to be very generous in your retirement years. Right? Like always present to love on your grandkids, serve in the church, give wisdom to younger people. Maybe you have a desire to disciple women or disciple teenagers, but right now you are drowning in goldfish and diapers. Maybe there's something in your heart that dreams of starting a business, but you know right now the timing is not right. And so like Nehemiah, maybe you have a burden from the Lord, and right now the hard part of obedience is waiting. If that's you this morning, what I want to encourage you with is that waiting does not mean that God has forgotten about you or the dream or the burden he's giving you. Oftentimes what waiting is a season of preparation. It's in the waiting when God does the preparing in us. And what's so, I would say actually maybe scary is there's stories in the Bible where God gave somebody a promise or a burden specifically for something and they weren't willing to wait, and it caused chaos and destruction. Like just think about Abraham. Specific promise from the Lord, you will have a child. You will bear a son, and he is going to be a father of many nations. Promise. Didn't want to wait on God's timing. And so he decides, I'll help God out a little bit. I've waited long enough. We'll take care of this on our own. And what's fascinating is that when you read the story, there are immediate consequences for him, his family, but like there's literally generational consequences of that decision that we see in violence and destruction in our world today. A God-given promise rushed ahead of God's timing can bring real consequences. And as I think about what it looks like to wait on the Lord, I think that these dreams and these burdens and these desires that God gives us often function a whole lot like pregnancy. Now hear me, I'm no pregnancy expert. Never experienced that myself. Darn. But think about it. When somebody's pregnant, what is it? There's excitement, there's anticipation, there's something that's growing and building even when nobody can see it. And here's the thing about pregnancy. We know better than to rush a pregnancy, don't we? Because what happen if a baby comes early, that thing that God has given, this good thing, all of a sudden it's in a vulnerable position. And so with pregnancy, right, we try not to rush it. Like literally there was a situation I heard of recently at our Boiling Springs campus where mom started labor very early and she was in the hospital for weeks just trying to keep the baby in to protect that baby. And I'm afraid that what happens spiritually is we do the opposite. We rush and we try to force God's timing before anything's ready. And I just wonder how many dreams and burdens have God given to people, and they maybe haven't played out to the fullness that God intended because we rushed it. And when it came out, it was vulnerable and it was fragile. We have to trust God enough to wait on his timing. And this is so hard because, guys, God is never late. But you know what he's also never? Early. Right? Like when we wait on the Lord, when we wait on him to move in his timing, when you look back, you can always see that God moved exactly when he needed to. And most of the time, not a moment sooner, right? We've got to trust him enough to wait. And what's interesting is that Nehemiah, he trusts God enough to wait, but what he also trusts God enough to do is to work while he waits. And so as we wait, we have to work while we wait. See, when you and I hear the word wait, we think passive, don't we? We think sitting there, sitting on our hands, doing nothing. But I don't think that's what waiting means in the Bible. I think waiting is a time of preparation, both that God is preparing something in us and that we are preparing ourselves to be used by God. And let me show it to you in this passage. Because as you look at these verses, Nehemiah has clearly prepared for this conversation. Right? The king asks him a direct question. How long is it going to take? He knows the answer. He knows the documentation that he's going to need to work through the bureaucratic process to get into there and have the authority he's going to need. And not only that, he knows the materials that will be required and the dude's name at Home Depot who works in the lumber department. Nehemiah is prepared because he doesn't know when the door is going to open, but he trusts God that it will. And so he prepares. And I think this principle is, I've heard it described as developing in the dark. Now, for those of you who are like under the age of 30, I'm going to blow your mind, okay? We used to have cameras that required real, tangible film. I know. And what would happen, the process to develop those images is that you would take it, it would all be on this roll, and they would have to go take it in what they called a dark room. And there was this process that they put this stuff under in the dark that allowed it to develop over time. And I think that what happens while we wait is that God often is developing us in the dark. There's a process with which he is forming us that nobody else sees, that nobody else knows about. And when the time is right, everyone gets to see the image of what he's been cultivating. That's what waiting on the Lord looks like. And so I'm curious, when you are in a season of waiting, are you frustrated and impatient? Or are you preparing and being shaped? Are you developing the character and the skills that you will need when God opens the door for you? Because I think that's exactly what Nehemiah did, and that's why God used him so powerfully. Developing in the dark, day after day. Right? And so what we get in this passage is this really interesting compression of time where we get a window into what he's been doing for months, and then there's this moment. There's this moment that all of his prayers and preparation have led to, and I want you to notice that even in the moment, he trusts God so much that he pauses to pray. Right? The king asks him a question, and he says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. It was his reflex. His reflex, before he even speaks, is to one more time say, God, I trust you. Give me favor with the king. And I think one of the reasons this can be so important for us is, I don't know about you, but I find it easier to pray for things not in the moment. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say there's a hard conversation that I know is coming up. I will pray to the Lord about it. I might pray to him for days about it. And then oftentimes, when the moment actually comes, like when I'm either walking into somebody's office or whatever I'm doing, I do not have the reflex that Nehemiah did to pause and pray, to continuously depend on the Lord. And I know that at least for me, I think what that reveals is that oftentimes I trust my own ability to prepare than I trust God in the moment. And listen, preparation is a good thing, but preparation is not the same thing as dependence on God. And what we see all throughout this story is that Nehemiah trusts God so much. His trust is all over this passage and all over the whole book. And what I want you to notice is that even though he trusts God, he still has fear. His trust is undeniable, but literally in verse 2, he says, I was terrified. Right? So trust in God and lack of fear aren't necessarily the same thing. It's possible for you and I to fear our circumstances and trust the Lord at the same time. And I think what's happening is that Nehemiah is wrestling with the same thing we wrestle with. It's ultimately, who do I fear most? Right? For him, it was, do I fear God or the king? For us, it's, do we fear the Lord or do we fear the opinions of others? Because so often, who you fear will determine who you obey. Who you fear will determine who you obey. Nehemiah fears the king. He fears these circumstances, but he obeys God. And so trust does not keep our fears from showing up, but what trust gives us the courage to do is to step forward in the moment. Trust turned to courage. Fear, I think what happens in fear is that it's a crossroads moment. It's the moment where we either trust God enough to carry us forward or our trust in God collapses and we don't move. And what we see in Nehemiah is that even though he's in a dangerous situation, he trusts the Lord and he moves forward in courage. Let me show you what some of his courage looks like, because it's so simple, but it's so powerful. The first thing he has the courage to do is tell the truth. The king asks him a question. Why do you look sad? And he doesn't lie. He doesn't pretend. He doesn't deflect. And let me explain to you why this honesty took real courage. Because it's multifaceted. In Nehemiah's world, it would have been inappropriate to appear sad in the presence of a king. A servant wasn't supposed to bring their personal emotion into the king's presence. Some of y'all, you've had a boss like that, right? Lindy, you can't shake your head. Yes, don't do it. Right, so there's this workplace etiquette component. But beyond that, a sad or solemn face could have been interpreted as as disloyalty. Right? Like you think about it, if you don't like somebody and you have to wait on them hand and foot all the time, it might be hard to keep your face smiling, hypothetically. And so, think about this. Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. That's like this weird combination of like sort of leading the Secret Service and head of the FDA. If the king assumes that Nehemiah is not for him, there will be no conversation. He gone. He's done. And as if that's not enough, we know from the book of Ezra, so Ezra and Nehemiah, they're kind of these overlapping books describing similar time. We know that in Ezra 4, the Jews in Jerusalem have started to try to rebuild the city. Their opponents realize this won't be good for them. They send a letter to this king, and the king stops their work. It's possible that that is the news that Nehemiah has gotten in chapter 1. The king issues a decree that there can be no rebuilding in Jerusalem. And so think about this. He's not only breaking etiquette, he's actually looking at the king and he's saying, I am grieving because of a decision that you made. That's a dangerous level of honesty. He tells the truth even when it could cost him everything. And I think you and I know that there's times when it takes real courage for you and I to tell the truth as well, don't we? When telling the truth might cost us approval, comfort, right? Like let's be real, it could cost you your job. And so often I think we live in this culture that's like, we can say whatever we want because social media is stupid. And we think, I'm just going to say the thing on social media and that's courageous. No. Courage is not saying whatever you want. Courage is telling the truth when silence feels easier. It's admitting you need help instead of pretending you're fine. It's having the hard conversation instead of avoiding it. Right? And that kind of courage can only come from a deep trust in God. And so he's courageous enough to tell the truth. And then he's courageous enough to seize the opportunity. Right? Notice, like, he gets his shot. Right? We were just talking about Hamilton in our house yesterday, right? Like, not gonna miss my shot, right? Yeah. And I think that as I've been reading this story, I think the question that God's put on my heart is, how often does he open a door that I don't have the courage to walk through? Because you got to think about it. What he's asking of the king is dangerous. But God opens the door for him. And he doesn't hesitate, he doesn't scramble, he doesn't panic. And what I like to picture, it's almost like he is spring-loaded, ready to move. Right? He's had months of praying and waiting and preparing, and the moment the door opens, he shoots through it. His preparation turned that moment into a God-sized opportunity. And that's why waiting well matters. That's why preparing well matters. Nehemiah did not wait for the door to open and then get ready. He trusted the Lord and got ready before it opened. And I'm curious, church, if we are as spring-loaded and ready for the doors that God opens for us. Like when a coworker asks, sort of in jest, like, why do you go to church every week? You know you could like sleep in sometimes, right? Right? Do we take that moment to joke it off, or do we lean in and tell the truth. Or maybe a friend asks, like, hey, how did you stay hopeful in this situation? And we could kind of go general platitudes, or we could really talk about who Jesus is and what he's done for us. God will open doors for us. The question is, are we ready? Are we on the balls of our feet ready to jump at the opportunities that God is giving us to partner with him in his work in the world? And listen, I want to make sure that no one hears me saying that, like, I think we just need to be impulsive. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, being ready is not the same thing as me saying, like, one moment you get kind of a whiff of something and you go in and you quit your job tomorrow. Maybe. But maybe there's some time to pause and pray and get counsel. Right? Nehemiah is ready. When God opens the door, he moves. And I just want to show you, he's not only courageous to seize the opportunity, he's courageous enough to ask for the impossible. He asks for a lot. Like, just think about this for a moment, okay? Imagine that God put a burden on your heart to, let's say, start a nonprofit, okay? And you went to your boss and you said, all right, here's the deal. I need a multiple year leave of absence. I need you to pay my full salary. Somehow, I don't know how this would work in our context. Somehow, I need you to, like, give me the authority and permission so that none of my opponents can slow down what I'm doing. Oh, also, I need the startup capital. Listen, I've had some good bosses. Ain't not a single one would have said, yes, absolutely, here you go. Nehemiah is asking for ridiculous things. Because on top of all that, he's like, oh, by the way, can you reverse a decree you've just given? And the king says yes. Right? Like, I don't want us to brush past how absurd it is that he asks for these things and that the king answers. And I just wonder, how often do we miss out on an opportunity because we don't have enough faith to ask? Not because God is unwilling, but because we've already decided the answer. He has the courage to ask for the impossible. And I think the reason he does this is because he knows he's not really asking the king. He knows he's asking the Lord. Proverbs 21:1 says this: the king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. I think Nehemiah believes this. And that's why he gives God all the credit. Look at what he says at the end, verse 8. He says, and the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. He knows it's God who's been protecting me. It's God who's been influencing the king. It's God who's providing all these things. And that's where I think this becomes incredibly encouraging for us. Because everything that Nehemiah needed to carry out the burden God gave him was given by God. And I think that in the same way, what God calls us to do, he provides what we need to do it. And I think there's a measure of that is true physically and financially, but I am certain that that is true spiritually. Because I think about the mission that God has given his followers on this earth. The decision the commission to make disciples. What's fascinating, what Nehemiah does is he asks for authority from the king to do the work. You know what Jesus says right before he tells us to do the work of making disciples? He says, I have been given all authority. Go therefore. So when we go to do God's work in the world, we are going from his authority and not ours. Nehemiah asked for the resources to do the work. Church, you know what we've been given? Followers of Christ, we have been given the Holy Spirit. The same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in us. And his word tells us that he has gifted us uniquely to do the work that he's created for us to do in advance. Everything that you need to do what God's given to you to do in your heart, he has or will supply you to do it. And what that means is that if he hasn't provided it yet, It doesn't mean he won't. It just doesn't mean the time is now. And so, church, let's remember that the same God who moved the heart of a pagan king is still at work and in control of the most powerful people in our world and in our lives. If he could direct the heart of the most powerful man in the world, he can direct the heart of anybody in our lives as well. The same God who provided authority and protection and provision for all that Nehemiah needed, he has not changed. He still supplies from his glorious resources. He still opens doors. He is still actively involved in accomplishing his purposes through ordinary people. We are not waiting on a distant God. We are trusting a present one. And we trust that that same God is still working through people who trust him. People who trust him enough to wait and to prepare and to pray and trust him more than they fear anything in their circumstances. And he is still a God who uses people who obey courageously. And so the question I want to leave us with today, church, is where is God inviting you to trust him more deeply and step forward more courageously? Is there an area of your life where he is inviting you to trust him more deeply? Or maybe there's a step that he is asking you to take courageously. And here's what I know. For some of us, courage may look quiet. It might look like a conversation with somebody you've been putting off. It might mean a prayer. It might mean an act of obedience you've been delaying. For others of us, it might be more bold, more public, more risky. But what I want to ask us to do, church, is to be the kind of people who ask God to show us where is he calling us to trust him and to ask him to give us the courage to obey.